People rarely recognize who they are becoming. They notice stress, they notice frustration, they notice fatigue. But identity changes quietly. One decision that feels reasonable, one compromise that feels small, one habit that doesn't seem urgent enough to question. That is how identity shifts. The Bible does not describe failure as a sudden collapse. It describes it as momentum. Ancient writers were not trying to catalog saints or villains. They were watching people. How they behaved when things worked, when pressure increased, when no one corrected them, and when success arrived before self-awareness did. What they recorded was not theology first. It was behavior. Patterns that appeared again and again across different personalities, different eras, different circumstances. And those patterns are unsettling because they don't belong to one kind of person. They appear in leaders and followers, in the confident and the hesitant, in the gifted and the disciplined, in people who mean well and in people who don't pause long enough to examine intention. This documentary is not asking, which Bible character are you? That question invites defense, comparison, distance. Instead, it asks something quieter. Which behaviors feel familiar right now? Because long before the Bible names a character, it describes a condition. Before Samson appears, there is unchecked ability. Before David falls, there is comfort without vigilance. Before Saul collapses, there is insecurity disguised as authority. Before Jonah runs, there is resistance framed as reason. The characters come later. First come the signs. Modern life has taught people to see identity as fixed, a personality, a label, a category. But Scripture treats identity as fluid, responsive, and deeply affected by pressure. People change when conditions change, and the Bible noticed that. It noticed how power alters restraint, how waiting reshapes integrity, how fear interrupts conviction, how success weakens self-examination, how silence feels safer than responsibility, until it isn't. These are not religious observations. They are human ones. You do not need to believe the Bible to recognize the patterns it recorded. You only need to watch people closely, and yourself. The most unsettling truth is this: no one becomes a biblical character by accident. They become one by repetition. The same choice, made often enough under similar pressure, produces a familiar shape. That shape has appeared before, and the Bible preserved it, not to accuse, but to expose. In the moments that follow, we will move through 7 behaviors, not as a checklist, not as advice, as mirrors. Each behavior will feel ordinary at first, defensible, even respectable. Only later will the names appear. Because once the name appears, people stop listening. They explain, they justify, they reassure themselves that the story belongs to someone else. But behavior doesn't lie, and patterns don't need belief to be accurate. They only need repetition. The question is not whether these stories are ancient. The question is whether they are still happening, quietly, predictably, and without interruption. Because history doesn't repeat itself loudly. It repeats itself through people who don't realize they're standing in a familiar place. The first behavior is easy to miss because it doesn't look like a flaw. It looks like capability. Things work when you step in. Problems resolve when you act. Others struggle with situations you move through effortlessly. And slowly, without ever saying it aloud, you begin to believe something dangerous. If I'm effective, I must be fine. This is where the pattern begins. The Bible shows this pattern through very different people who shared one quiet mistake. They mistook ability for stability. Samson is the most obvious example. His strength is undeniable, immediate, public. He doesn't train for it. He doesn't refine it. It simply appears when needed. And because it works every time, Samson never learns to manage himself, only his enemies. Victory becomes reinforcement. Each success teaches him the same lesson. I can handle this. Boundaries begin to feel unnecessary when outcomes stay positive. But the Bible places Samson beside another figure who looks nothing like him. Saul. Saul's gift is not physical power, it's authority. He is chosen quickly, elevated publicly, given influence before he understands how to carry it. And like Samson, things work at first. Enemies retreat. The people approve. Leadership appears to fit. But something subtle happens when gift replaces character. Correction feels insulting, waiting feels inefficient, discipline feels optional. Both men rely on what comes naturally instead of what must be maintained. Samson trusts strength. Saul trusts position. Neither invests in restraint. This is why the Bible introduces their collapse without drama. No sudden fall, no immediate punishment, just small moments where impulse replaces reflection. Samson touches what he shouldn't. Saul acts before instruction is complete, and nothing bad happens right away. That's the danger. When ability keeps producing results, self-examination feels unnecessary. You assume the gift will compensate for what you don't manage. This pattern still exists. You see it in people who are talented but reactive, in leaders who rely on charisma instead of accountability, in individuals who survive situations that should have humbled them, and mistake survival for endorsement. The Bible never suggests that gift is the problem is confusion. When people believe effectiveness equals integrity, they stop asking the questions that protect them. They stop slowing down, they stop checking motives, they stop building guardrails, and when the gift finally fails, because gifts always do, there is nothing underneath to catch the fall. Samson loses strength, Saul loses authority, not because they were untalented, but because they were unexamined. This behavior leaves behind an uncomfortable question. When things work for you, do you grow more careful or more careless? Because gift can open doors, but only character keeps them open. And the Bible is clear about this. Ability reveals potential. Character determines direction. The second behavior is quieter than the first. It doesn't feel like arrogance. It feels like normal life continuing. Nothing is broken. Nothing has failed. No crisis has arrived to demand change, and so the warning is easy to dismiss. This pattern appears when signals are present, but consequences are delayed. You notice discomfort, a tension you can't quite explain, a decision that felt rushed, a moment that didn't sit right afterward. But the next day arrives. Life continues. The system still works, so you move on. The Bible records this pattern with unsettling patience. David's story does not begin with disaster. It begins with success. He is established, respected, secure. And in that security, vigilance fades. The text notes something small, easy to overlook. When kings went out to war, David stayed behind. No judgment is attached to the statement. No accusation is made, it is simply observed. This is how early warnings appear, not as alarms, but as deviations. David's decision does not feel dangerous, it feels earned. He has fought before, he has proven himself. Nothing suggests that staying back will cost him anything, and for a moment, it doesn't. This reinforces the pattern, because when nothing collapses immediately, warnings lose urgency. Solomon follows the same arc. His early reign is defined by wisdom, clarity, discernment. He listens. He governs well. He builds stability. But woven into that success are small allowances, relationships that compromise focus, alliances that dilute conviction, luxuries that distract from discipline. None of it produces immediate failure. In fact, everything continues to expand. This is the danger of delayed consequence. It teaches people that discomfort is optional, that concern is unnecessary, that intuition can be overridden by outcome. This pattern still exists. You see it in people who sense misalignment but wait for evidence dramatic enough to justify change. in those who postpone correction because nothing bad has happened yet. Early warnings are rarely dramatic. They arrive as unease, as quiet resistance, as moments you explain away. The Bible never portrays collapse as unpredictable. It portrays it as ignored. David does not fall because he was unaware. He falls because he dismissed the early signs. Solomon does not lose clarity overnight. He loses it gradually, as warning after warning goes unaddressed. The second behavior is not recklessness, it is delay, and delay trains people to trust outcomes over insight. This behavior leaves behind a precise question. When something inside you signals caution, do you listen, or do you wait for damage to make the decision for you? Because by the time collapse is obvious, choice has already narrowed. And the Bible's most consistent observation is this: disaster rarely arrives without notice. It arrives after notice is repeatedly ignored. The third behavior sounds reasonable. Responsible, even. You're not refusing. You're just not ready. Not now. Not yet. Not under these conditions. You tell yourself you're being careful, that you need more clarity, more confirmation, more stability. This is how delay disguises itself. The Bible captures this pattern through people who were not confused about what needed to be done. They were conflicted about what action would cost them. Jonah is the clearest example. He understands the assignment. There is no ambiguity, no miscommunication. What he resists is not the task, but the outcome. Jonah knows that if he acts, change will follow. For people he does not want to see restored. So he reframes resistance as reason. He doesn't argue with the instruction, he creates distance from it. This is the Jonah pattern, delay that feels justified because obedience threatens preference. But Jonah is not alone. Moses follows a similar arc, with a different tone. He is called and immediately responds with explanation. He lists limitations, he names weaknesses, he points to circumstances. I'm not the right person. I'm not prepared. This won't work. Moses' hesitation sounds humble. Jonah's sounds defensive, but both arrive at the same place. Inaction. The Bible treats both moments with restraint. It does not shame hesitation, it observes consequence. Delay stretches tension, avoidance accumulates pressure. Jonah's delay does not remove responsibility, it displaces it. Others are drawn into the storm. Innocent people feel the effects. Moses' delay does not cancel calling, it complicates the path. Frustration increases. Clarity becomes costly. This pattern still exists. You see it in people who know what conversation they need to have, but wait for the right moment. In those who recognize a necessary change but postpone it until circumstances feel safer. Delay feels wise, until consequences arrive uninvited. The danger of this behavior is not hesitation. It is self-deception. You begin to believe that waiting is the same as discernment, that postponement equals preparation. But the Bible draws a sharp distinction. There is a difference between timing and avoidance. One sharpens clarity, the other dulls it. Jonah's storm arrives not as punishment, but as interruption. Moses' resistance is met not with dismissal, but insistence. Action eventually occurs, but at greater cost. The third behavior leaves behind a question that is uncomfortable because it's specific. Are you waiting because the moment isn't right? Or because acting would disrupt your control? Because delay doesn't neutralize responsibility, it transfers its weight, and the longer action is postponed, the heavier it becomes. The Bible's observation is precise. What you refuse to face willingly will eventually face you without consent. The fourth behavior doesn't look like weakness. It looks like responsibility. You're active, engaged, needed. Your schedule is full. Your attention is divided. Your days are productive. And because things are getting done, no one questions what might be missing. This is how avoidance becomes respectable. The Bible captures this pattern through people who are not lazy. They are overloaded. Martha is the clearest example. She is not irresponsible. She is attentive. She anticipates needs. She manages details. She carries the weight of preparation. Her frustration does not come from idleness. It comes from imbalance. The text describes her as distracted by much serving, not disobedient, not selfish, distracted. That word matters, because distraction doesn't mean neglect. It means misplacement. Martha is doing good things, just not the necessary one. And when activity becomes constant, honesty becomes optional. Busyness creates noise. Noise prevents reflection. This pattern appears again in a very different figure. King Saul. As pressure increases around him, Saul fills space with ritual. He offers sacrifices. He performs visible acts of devotion. He stays active, but he avoids the deeper issue: fear of losing approval. Saul's activity masks insecurity. He stays busy because stillness would force him to confront doubt. This is how the pattern works. Activity becomes armor. You stay occupied, so you don't have to examine motive. You stay productive, so you don't have to address discomfort. This pattern still exists. You see it in people who volunteer constantly, but avoid difficult conversations. In leaders who manage systems well, but neglect self-examination. In individuals who equate usefulness with worth. Busyness is rewarded culturally. It looks like discipline. It looks like commitment. But the Bible treats it cautiously, because when activity replaces awareness, clarity erodes. Martha's frustration surfaces not because others are wrong, but because she feels unseen. Saul's downfall accelerates not because he stopped acting, but because he stopped listening. The fourth behavior asks a quiet question: is your activity producing alignment or preventing it? Because staying busy can delay collapse, but it cannot prevent it. Eventually, stillness arrives, by choice or by force. And when it does, what surfaces is not productivity. It is truth. The Bible's observation is unsettling. People rarely avoid honesty by lying. They avoid it by staying occupied. The fifth behavior emerges when visibility increases, when people are watching, when reputation carries weight, when being wrong feels expensive. This pattern doesn't begin with deception. It begins with fear. Fear of losing trust, fear of appearing weak, fear of undoing the story others believe about you. And so, truth becomes negotiable. The Bible records this behavior with painful clarity. King Saul reaches this moment publicly. He disobeys an instruction, not out of rebellion, but out of anxiety. When confronted, his instinct is not reflection, it is explanation. He reframes the failure, he highlights intention, he points to outcomes, and then he says something revealing: I feared the people. This is where integrity fractures. Saul is less concerned with alignment than with appearance. Correction threatens image. Admission threatens authority. So he chooses preservation, not of truth, but of perception. This pattern appears again in a very different context. Ananias and Sapphira. They do not lie to survive, they lie to belong. They want the appearance of sacrifice without the cost of it. They give, but not fully. And when asked directly, they choose image over honesty. The Bible treats both stories without drama. No psychological analysis, no editorializing. It simply shows the same behavior producing the same collapse. Because image management always consumes integrity. This pattern still exists. You see it in people who curate how they're seen more carefully than how they live. In leaders who hide mistakes to maintain credibility. In individuals who fear exposure more than misalignment. The danger of this behavior is not that people become dishonest. It's that they become divided. Public self, private reality. Once this split forms, energy shifts. Instead of asking, "Is this right?" the question becomes, "How does this look?" And the moment image becomes priority, truth becomes a liability. Saul's authority erodes not because he failed, but because he refused to own failure. Ananias and Sapphira collapsed not because they withheld, but because they pretended. The Bible's message here is precise. Integrity does not mean perfection. It means alignment. When alignment is broken, image cannot repair it. The fifth behavior leaves behind an uncomfortable question. When you're wrong, do you correct the action or manage the story? Because the more effort it takes to maintain image, the less energy remains to protect integrity.
David is the
And eventually,
man now.
image collapses under the weight of what it's hiding. The sixth behavior rarely feels dangerous. It feels deserved. You've worked hard. You've endured pressure. You've shown discipline when others didn't. So when restraint loosens slightly, it doesn't register as compromise. It registers as relief. This pattern appears when people begin to believe that past obedience has purchased future permission, that sacrifice creates credit, that discipline builds entitlement. The Bible records this behavior in people whose decline is not sudden, but gradual. Solomon embodies this pattern with painful subtlety. He begins with clarity, focus, wisdom. His early decisions are careful, measured, but success changes the internal equation. One allowance follows another. One exception becomes routine. Nothing breaks immediately. Prosperity continues, influence expands. The system still functions. This is the danger of earned compromise, because when nothing collapses, compromise stops feeling like compromise. It feels reasonable. Solomon does not abandon wisdom. He applies it selectively. He maintains public discipline while allowing private indulgence. And over time, the divide widens. The Bible shows this same pattern in a very different life. Lot. Lot is not introduced as corrupt. He is introduced as someone who chooses comfort. He pitches his tent near what is convenient, familiar, profitable. Each choice feels small, defensible, until one day he is no longer near compromise. He is inside it. Lot never chooses collapse directly. He chooses proximity. This is how compromise works. You don't abandon values. You make room for exceptions. You don't reject restraint. You redefine it. And slowly, what once required justification becomes habit. This pattern still exists. You see it in people who relax standards once they reach a certain level. In those who excuse behavior because they've already proven themselves. In individuals who believe consistency is only required until success arrives. The Bible does not portray compromise as rebellion. It portrays it as accumulation, small permissions stacked quietly until alignment dissolves. Solomon's wisdom does not vanish overnight. It becomes diluted. Lot's discomfort does not disappear suddenly. It becomes normalized. The sixth behavior leaves behind a confronting question. Do you treat discipline as identity or as a phase? Because when restraint is temporary, compromise is inevitable. And the Bible's observation is sharp. What you excuse repeatedly eventually defines you. The final behavior is the most difficult to confront because it feels passive. You're not doing anything wrong. You're simply not doing anything. This pattern appears when awareness meets risk. You see what's happening. You understand the implications. You recognize the direction things are moving. And still you remain quiet. Not because you agree, but because speaking would cost you something. The Bible treats this behavior with unusual seriousness. Esther stands inside this tension. She is positioned uniquely, protected, insulated. And because of that protection, silence feels reasonable. Why draw attention? Why risk stability? Why step into danger unnecessarily? At first, Esther's silence is understandable. She's not a leader by ambition. She did not seek influence. But there comes a moment when neutrality disappears, when silence itself becomes a decision. This is the Esther pattern. Not ignorance, not fear alone. Calculation. She understands that speaking may cost her everything, but she also realizes that silence will cost others. This is where the pattern sharpens. Knowing the truth does not require courage. Acting on it does. The Bible places Peter in a similar moment, but under different pressure. Peter knows exactly who he is loyal to. His convictions are sincere, publicly stated. But when consequence becomes immediate, when safety is threatened, he chooses silence and then denial. Peter does not collapse because he lacks belief. He collapses because fear outruns conviction. This is the danger of silence. It trains people to protect themselves first and justify it later. This pattern still exists. You see it in people who recognize injustice but avoid involvement, in those who understand what should be said but wait for someone else to say it, in individuals who tell themselves that silence is wisdom, when it is really self-preservation. The Bible does not condemn caution, but it exposes delay, because silence is never neutral. It always benefits the direction things are already moving. Esther eventually speaks, not because the risk disappears, but because neutrality becomes impossible. Peter eventually confronts his silence, not because fear vanishes, but because avoidance becomes unbearable. This is the final pattern, not weakness, not ignorance, reluctance to bear the cost of truth, and it leaves behind the most personal question of all. When you know what is right, do you wait for safety? Or do you accept responsibility because silence feels harmless until its consequences become visible? And by then, the moment to act freely has often passed. Most people don't fail because they choose the wrong path. They fail because they stay in familiar patterns too long. The Bible didn't record these stories to assign blame. It recorded them to preserve recognition. Because once a pattern is seen, it loses its power to operate unnoticed. You don't need to decide who you are today. You only need to notice what you keep repeating. That awareness changes everything. If one of these behaviors felt uncomfortably familiar, sit with it. That discomfort isn't accusation, it's clarity, and clarity is always the beginning of movement. If you want to explore more stories like this, not as lessons, but as mirrors, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. The next episode examines a biblical decision that looked small at the time, but reshaped history in ways no one expected. History has patterns. So do people. The question is whether we notice them before they repeat.